Take this cheap thing off. My family's name deserves better than thrift store jewelry.
Ryan, don't touch it, please.
You didn't just break my wife's necklace. You may have destroyed the evidence that kept a murderer free for 30 years.
No one at that wedding knew the old silver necklace around Margaret Carter's neck had been worth more than every diamond in the room combined. No one knew that in the next hour, a wedding would become a courtroom, a celebration would become a confession, and a family everyone envied would be exposed as something built entirely on borrowed names. Why had Margaret refused to remove that necklace for 30 years, through every summer, every shower, every hospital gown? Why did James look almost prepared the moment it broke, as though he had been rehearsing this exact second in his mind for decades? Why did Ryan's parents, the untouchable Whitmores, go pale and reach for each other's hands the instant the pendant hit the floor? Was this really about family pride, or something far darker hiding underneath it? Who in that ballroom had been lying, and who had simply been waiting? Because someone had been waiting. In the very back row, at a table nobody had bothered to seat properly, sat an elderly man in a gray suit that did not match the wedding's palette. He hadn't touched his wine. He hadn't smiled for a single photograph. He simply watched Margaret's neck the way a man watches a door he has been guarding his whole life. Nobody noticed him yet. They would. 3 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. James Carter was a retired architect, the kind of man who measured his words the way he once measured blueprints. Carefully, twice, before committing to anything. He rarely raised his voice, rarely lost his temper, and had a habit of watching a room quietly before he ever spoke in it. Margaret was gentler, warmer, the sort of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and always had. She never left the house without one thing: a thin, old silver necklace with a pendant so plain that most people assumed it was costume jewelry, a sentimental trinket from some early anniversary. She never explained it. She never took it off, not for weddings, not for surgery, not for a single day in 30 years. Their daughter Emily had grown into a sharp, successful attorney who believed, with the confidence of someone who had never been lied to by the people she loved, that she was marrying into a family as solid as her own. Ryan Whitmore was charming in the practiced way of men who had spent their whole lives being told they were exceptional, an investment executive, magnetic at dinner parties, deeply, almost anxiously obsessed with how things looked from the outside. His parents had built that obsession in him brick by brick. Richard Whitmore was, as far as the world knew, a self-made billionaire, a man who had clawed his way from nothing into boardrooms and country clubs. Victoria Whitmore was elegant in the coldest sense of the word, a woman who could compliment your dress and insult your worth in the same sentence, who measured every human being she met by the number attached to their name. "She's really going to wear that to the rehearsal dinner?" Victoria had murmured to Richard weeks earlier, watching Margaret laugh with Emily across the room, one hand instinctively resting on the pendant at her throat, as it always did whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near the past. "It looks like something she found in a parking lot." "Let it go," Richard said, though something flickered behind his eyes that wasn't irritation. It was closer to recognition. He looked away too quickly. James noticed. James noticed everything. He checked his watch that night, and the night after, and the night after that, with a precision that had nothing to do with the time. At the guest book table on the morning of the wedding, an elderly man in gray signed his name using only 2 initials, then slipped quietly into the crowd before the wedding planner could even ask his name for the seating chart. Nobody thought anything of it. There is always one guest nobody quite remembers inviting. The ceremony itself was, by every outward measure, perfect. The venue sat on the Charleston coastline, the sun lowering itself into the water in long orange ribbons, string lights strung between the oaks, the scent of magnolia thick in the warm evening air. Emily walked down the aisle, radiant and certain. Ryan wept, actually wept, at the sight of her, And for a moment it was easy to forget that anything could ever go wrong in a family that looked this happy. It began to unravel during the family photographs. "Could someone please?" "Victoria," said under her breath to the photographer, loud enough for only the people beside her to hear. "Ask her to tuck that thing under her dress. It's throwing off the whole shot." "Victoria," Emily said, laughing it off, assuming it was simply nerves. "It's my mom's necklace. She's worn it as long as I've been alive. It's embarrassing, Emily. Honestly, it looks cheap." Victoria's smile never wavered, which somehow made it worse. "This is a Whitmore wedding photograph. It will be printed. People will see it."
Mom, you don't have to.
Emily started. But Margaret had already gone very still, her hand rising to the pendant the way it always did. "I'm not taking it off," Margaret said softly, and there was something in her voice that was not stubbornness. It was fear dressed up as calm. James said nothing. He simply moved half a step closer to his wife, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, close enough to remind her, without a word, that she wasn't standing there alone. Ryan, caught between his bride's family and his own, did what men like Ryan often do when they feel the ground shifting under a room. He tried to smooth it over by proving whose side he was really on. "Margaret, come on," he said, laughing in a way that was meant to sound light and didn't. "It really doesn't go with the dress, just for the photos, and you can put it right back on after." "Ryan," Emily said, a warning edge creeping into her voice. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Ryan said, and something in his tone had shifted, some old resentment about never quite measuring up to his own parents' image bubbling up in the worst possible moment. "It's a wedding, not a flea market." The temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees. Guests who had been laughing a moment earlier found excuses to look at their phones, their shoes, the ocean, anywhere but the small family drama unfolding in front of the cake table. At the reception, the cracks widened. Champagne loosened tongues. Victoria made another comment, sharper this time, about how some families simply didn't understand what it meant to marry up. Richard laughed too hard at his own toast, his eyes darting, more than once, toward the old man in gray sitting quietly at the back of the room, though he never said why. And Ryan, 3 glasses of scotch deep into an evening that had already bruised his pride once, reached the end of whatever patience he had left. "You know what?" he said, standing so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, silencing the table beside him. "I'm done pretending this doesn't bother me." "Ryan, sit down," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. He didn't sit down. He crossed the floor in 4 long strides and reached for his new mother-in-law's throat. "Take this cheap thing off. My family's name deserves better than thrift store jewelry." "Ryan, don't touch it, please." The chain snapped. The pendant vanished beneath the crowd, and James Carter stood up. "You didn't just break my wife's necklace. You may have destroyed the evidence that kept a murderer free for 30 years. The ballroom froze in the kind of silence that has weight. Guests looked at each other, waiting for someone to laugh, to say it was a joke, an unusual wedding toast, anything. No one laughed. James's face did not invite laughter. Margaret had both hands pressed to her bare throat, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, not from the pain of the yank, but from something deeper, something that had been braced against for 30 years and had finally happened. Ryan stood frozen, his hand still curled around empty air where the necklace had been. What are you talking about?" "James, it's a necklace. I'll buy her 10 necklaces. "Find it," James said, not to Ryan, but to the room, his voice low and absolutely certain. "Find that pendant before somebody dies protecting what's inside it." Guests dropped to their knees in $5,000 dresses and rented tuxedos, hands sweeping under tables, under chairs, under the cake stand. Confusion turned quickly to fear as people began to understand that whatever this was, it was not a metaphor. James walked, without hurrying, to each of the ballroom's 4 exits, and quietly, deliberately, locked them one at a time. A security guard tried to stop him and then didn't. Something in James's calm more persuasive than any argument could have been. "James, what is happening?" Emily's voice cracked as she grabbed her father's arm. "You're scaring people. You're scaring me." "I know, sweetheart," James said, and for the first time that night his composure wavered. Just slightly, just enough to show how much it was costing him to hold it. "I've been scared for 30 years. Tonight it finally gets to be someone else's turn." Quick pause, because a few of you always ask how stories like this actually get built. 2 books, both in the description below. Script to Screen is the blueprint for writing hooks and twists that keep people watching all the way to the end. The same structure you just saw with that necklace. And same face. Every frame solves the other half of the puzzle, keeping your characters looking like themselves across every single AI image, whether you're in Flow, Whisk, Midjourney, or anywhere else. Links below if you want either one. Now, back to the Carters. Confusion had barely settled into fear when the ballroom doors, already locked, were opened again from the outside. Not by security, but by 2 men in dark suits who moved with the unmistakable calm of people who had done this before. Behind them walked the elderly man in gray, no longer quietly seated, no longer unnoticed. He held up a small leather badge, and the gold shield inside caught the chandelier light. "Special Agent Thomas Reyes, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned room. "Nobody in this room is under arrest, yet, but nobody is leaving either." "The FBI?" Richard Whitmore's voice came out strangled. "This is a private event. You can't just—" "Mr. Whitmore," Reyes said, turning toward him slowly, almost gently, the way a man turns toward something he has hunted for a very long time. "Or should I say, Mr. Marsh, we've been waiting 30 years for someone to touch that necklace." The color drained entirely from Richard's face. Victoria's hand found his arm, gripping it so hard her knuckles went white, and for the first time all evening, her cold composure cracked into something that looked very much like panic. "Mr. Marsh," Ryan repeated, looking between his father and the agent, his voice small in a way it had never been small before. "Dad, what is he talking about, Dad?" Richard didn't answer. He was staring at Margaret's bare throat as though he could still see the pendant hanging there, as though 30 years hadn't passed at all. Agent Reyes turned to the room and, in a voice that had clearly given this kind of speech before, began to explain. 30 years earlier, Margaret Carter had not been Margaret Carter. She'd been a young forensic accountant working for a pension management firm in Ohio. The kind of quiet, meticulous employee nobody paid much attention to until the numbers stopped adding up. She'd found it almost by accident, a slow, deliberate siphoning of retirement funds belonging to hundreds of ordinary workers, factory employees and teachers and machinists who had spent their whole lives trusting that money would be there when they needed it most. She copied everything she found onto microfilm, tucked inside a small hollow pendant a jeweler friend had built for her, the kind of object no one would ever think to search. She didn't know yet who was responsible. She only knew she wasn't safe. 2 weeks later, a fire tore through the firm's records room in the middle of the night. Investigators called it faulty wiring. Margaret knew better. One of the executives she'd been quietly building a case against disappeared from public life entirely within the month, along with 2 of his closest colleagues, never to be seen under those names again. And then people who had asked too many questions started disappearing too. A junior auditor, a whistleblower's lawyer, a private investigator hired by one of the victim families. James, who back then was a young architect renting the apartment beside hers, was the only person Margaret told. He helped her vanish. New names, new state, new life built quietly, brick by brick, the same patient way he built everything. They married under new identities in a small courthouse with no guests, and Margaret wore the pendant every single day after that, because she had learned, in the worst way possible, that she could trust herself and almost no one else. "She never told me," Emily whispered, staring at her mother as though seeing her for the first time. "Mom, all this time?" "I couldn't," Margaret said, her voice trembling but steady underneath the tremble. the voice of a woman who had carried something enormous for longer than her daughter had been alive. "If I told you, it made you a target too. I thought I could keep it locked away forever, in a necklace nobody would ever look at twice." Agent Reyes continued, and the room listened in the kind of silence usually reserved for funerals. Richard Whitmore, he explained, had not built his fortune from nothing. Richard Whitmore's real name was Daniel Marsh, one of the 3 executives who vanished the same month as the fire, one of the men Margaret had been building a case against before she disappeared. He had spent 30 years constructing an entirely new identity, new name, new face after 2 quiet surgeries, new fortune seeded, investigators now believed, by a portion of the very money he had stolen decades earlier. "Victoria knew," Reyes said, and every head in the room turned toward her. "She helped build the identity. New paperwork, new history, a new man from the ashes of an old crime. That's not—" Victoria's voice failed her halfway through the denial. She didn't finish the sentence because there was nothing left to finish it with. Ryan stood in the middle of the ballroom looking like a man whose entire floor had opened beneath him. The mansion he grew up in, the business his father had handed him a stake in, the trust fund, the inheritance he had, an hour earlier, been so desperate to protect from the embarrassment of a second-hand necklace. All of it, every dollar, traced back to stolen pensions and disappeared witnesses, and a fire that had been set to erase a young woman who refused to look away from the truth. "I didn't know," Ryan said, "to no one and everyone," his voice breaking. "I swear to God I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," James said quietly, and it was somehow worse than if he'd accused him outright. "That's what makes it so easy for people like your father to build lives like this. Good, decent people who never ask where the money came from." Emily had gone very still beside her husband, staring at him as though trying to find, in his face, some sign of the family that had raised him. Then the search teams, who had been combing the ballroom floor since James's warning, finally called out from beneath the head table. Someone had found the pendant, wedged against a table leg, dented but intact. They cracked it open with careful, gloved hands. It was empty. A murmur went through the room. All eyes turned toward Ryan, the obvious, easy conclusion settling over the crowd like a held breath. He'd broken it. He must have taken something. He must have known. "I didn't do anything with it," Ryan said, backing up, hands raised. "I ripped it off her neck. I didn't open it. I don't even know how it opens." And then, quietly, in the middle of all that panic, James began to smile. Margaret smiled too, small and tired, and finally relieved, in a way that had nothing to do with the empty pendant in the agent's hands. "It's been empty for 6 years," James said, and the room turned to him in disbelief. "The necklace stopped being where we hid the truth a long time ago. It became something else instead." He reached down beside his chair and lifted a worn, leather-bound portfolio, the kind an architect might carry blueprints in for 40 years, scuffed at the corners, unremarkable, sitting quietly on the floor beside him the entire evening while everyone searched the floor for something far smaller. "6 years ago we moved everything here," James said, opening the portfolio to reveal, tucked behind old drawings and yellowed sketches, a slim sealed folder of documents, an old data drive, photographs, a chain of evidence rebuilt patiently over decades. Not a safe, not a bank, not a vault. Nowhere anyone would think to look. The necklace was never the hiding place anymore, Agent Reyes. It was bait. "Bait," Reyes repeated, and for the first time all night, he looked almost impressed. "You knew the guilty party would react the moment someone tried to take it from her. We've spent 30 years learning what kind of—" "People go quiet with fear when a memory resurfaces," James said, glancing, not unkindly, at Richard, whose face had gone the color of ash. "We knew that if the necklace were ever threatened in front of the right people, they wouldn't be able to help themselves. Guilt doesn't stay hidden forever. It just waits for the wrong moment to slip." Security footage from the reception, phone recordings guests hadn't realized mattered. Richard's own panicked reaction the instant the chain snapped. Financial records the FBI had been quietly assembling for years while waiting for exactly this kind of trigger. All of it, Reyes explained, had just been captured, corroborated, and confirmed in front of 300 witnesses. Ryan's impulsive, prideful grab for a necklace he thought was cheap had become the single act that finally exposed 30 years of stolen money, false identities, and buried deaths. Federal agents moved through the ballroom with quiet efficiency, and within minutes Richard Whitmore, Daniel Marsh, and Victoria stood in handcuffs beside the wedding cake that still bore their family's monogram in sugar frosting. Guests who had spent the evening admiring the Whitmores' wealth now watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence as that wealth was formally read its rights. "Richard," Victoria said, her voice small for the first time in her adult life, "say something." He didn't. Emily walked slowly toward her husband, who stood frozen in the wreckage of everything he thought he knew about his own family. She reached down and, with quiet, deliberate hands, slid the wedding ring from her finger. "Emily, please," Ryan said, reaching for her hand before she could pull it fully away. "Listen to me. I didn't know any of this. You have to believe me." "I know you didn't steal the money," Emily said, and her voice, though breaking, did not waver. "But you chose your family's pride over my mother's dignity the second things got uncomfortable. You didn't know about the money, Ryan, but you knew exactly what you were doing when you grabbed her throat in front of 300 people. Ryan opened his mouth and closed it again, because there was nothing true he could say that would undo it. He realized, standing there in his ruined tuxedo in a ballroom crawling with federal agents, that the necklace had never been the most valuable thing he'd destroyed that night. It was trust. Hers, her family's, and whatever fragile version of himself he might have become, if he'd simply chosen kindness instead of pride when it mattered. James crossed the room and placed the leather portfolio directly into Agent Reyes's hands. 30 years, James said quietly. She carried it every single day, so it would never leave her side, and so no one would ever think to look. 30 years, Reyes echoed, closing his hand carefully around it. And one wedding to finally end it. Margaret stood in the middle of the ballroom, bare-throated for the first time in decades, tears still on her face, but something in her posture had changed. The weight that had bent her shoulders forward for 30 years, so subtly no one had ever noticed it was there, had finally, visibly lifted. James walked back to her and took both her hands in his. "It's over," he said softly. "You don't have to hold it anymore." "I don't know who I am without it," Margaret admitted, half laughing, half crying. 30 years of touching my own throat every time I got scared. Before that quiet evening on the dock, though, there had been weeks of aftermath to survive, and none of it had come easily. The morning after the wedding, reporters camped outside the Carter's house before the sun had even finished rising. Emily sat at her mother's kitchen table, still in yesterday's makeup, staring at a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked again, for what felt like the 100th time, though her voice had softened from anger into something closer to grief. "Not when I got engaged. Not even the night before the wedding, when you must have known something like this could happen." "Because the moment I told you," Margaret said, reaching across the table for her daughter's hand, "you would have had to carry it too. I spent 30 years making sure you never had to look over your shoulder the way I did. I wasn't going to hand that fear to you as a wedding gift." "I would rather have known," Emily said. "I would rather have been scared with you than blindsided in front of 300 people." Margaret didn't have an answer for that. She simply nodded, because her daughter wasn't wrong, and admitting that was its own kind of relief. James, meanwhile, sat with Agent Reyes in the study, going through 3 decades of documentation that had never been meant for anyone's eyes but his and Margaret's. "You could have brought this to us years ago," Reyes said, flipping carefully through the portfolio. "We had an open case. Cold, but open. You didn't have to wait for a wedding to blow up in your daughter's face. "We tried once," James said quietly. 19 years ago. A different agent, a different office. We were told there wasn't enough corroborating evidence to move against men who'd already legally changed their names twice over. We were told to wait for something concrete. He closed the portfolio gently. Richard gave it to us himself, the second he panicked in front of a room full of witnesses. Some doors only open when the person on the other side forgets they're being watched. And if Ryan hadn't grabbed the necklace that night, Reyes asked. Then we would have kept waiting, James said. We were good at waiting. It was the one skill this whole ordeal ever really taught us. Across town, in a hotel suite the Whitmores would not be permitted to return home from, Ryan sat across a folding table from two federal investigators, answering questions about board meetings and offshore accounts he had never once thought to question growing up. "I signed whatever my father put in front of me," he said, running a hand through hair that hadn't been styled since the reception. "I thought that was what trust meant. I never imagined asking where any of it came from." "Most people in your position don't," the investigator said, not unkindly. "That's usually the point." It took Ryan 3 separate interviews before he stopped defending his father out of old habit and started, slowly, actually listening to what 30 years of stolen pensions had cost real families. The Ohio machinist who'd worked until his hands gave out only to lose his retirement in a single fraudulent quarter. The widow who'd spent a decade in a smaller apartment than she should have needed. The daughter of a whistleblower who had simply vanished the same year Margaret did and had never been found at all. That last detail broke something open in him. There was another person, Ryan said quietly during his 4th interview, staring at a photograph investigators had shown him of a man named Peter Alvarez, the private investigator who had once tried to trace Margaret's disappearance and never surfaced again. "My father talked about him once, years ago, at a dinner. He called him a loose thread that got handled. I thought it was a business expression. I didn't think—" He stopped, unable to finish. "Most people don't," the investigator said again, and this time it sounded less like reassurance and more like an indictment of everything Ryan had never bothered to question. Weeks later, Ryan showed up unannounced at the Carters' front door, thinner than he'd been at the wedding, his usual confidence entirely gone. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said, when James opened the door and simply stood there, waiting. "I just needed to say it to your faces instead of through a lawyer. I'm sorry. Not for the money. I never touched the money. I'm sorry for choosing my pride over Margaret's dignity when it mattered. I've had a lot of time to sit with that." "Come in," Margaret said quietly, from somewhere behind James in the hallway. "You can say the rest of it over coffee." He didn't stay long, and nothing was fully resolved that afternoon. But it was, James thought later, the first honest conversation Ryan had ever had in that house that wasn't performed for someone else's benefit. "You're the woman who kept 300 people's stolen retirements alive in her memory for 3 decades, James said. "You're the reason those families are finally going to get something back. You were never the necklace, Margaret. You were always just you." The trial itself stretched across 11 weeks, and Charleston society, so quick to admire the Whitmores months earlier, packed the courtroom gallery every single day, hungry for a version of the story it could finally understand. Victoria's lawyer tried, early on, to paint her as a victim of her husband's decades-old deception, a woman who had simply followed the man she loved without asking questions. It might have worked if the prosecution hadn't produced the paperwork. "Mrs. Whitmore," the prosecutor said, holding up a stack of forged identification documents dated to the year of the fire, "can you explain your signature on these notarized affidavits, establishing your husband's new legal identity as Richard Whitmore, 6 weeks after Daniel Marsh's former colleagues reported him missing and presumed dead?" Victoria's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. Victoria said nothing at all, which the jury, watching closely, understood as its own kind of answer. Richard took the stand only once, near the end, and it was Margaret's testimony the day before that seemed to finally break whatever composure he had left. She had sat calmly, hands folded, and described in plain, unhurried detail the night the records room burned, the calls that stopped being returned, the friends who stopped recognizing her on the street because she had, quite deliberately, become someone else to survive. "I want the record to reflect," she said, near the end of her testimony, looking directly at Richard for the first time since the arrest, "that I am not angry anymore. I spent 30 years angry, and it never once made me feel safe. I only feel safe now, sitting in this room, telling the truth out loud." Richard did not meet her eyes. When it was finally his turn to speak, his lawyer having advised against it and lost the argument, Richard rose slowly, older somehow than he'd looked even at the wedding, all of the practiced charm gone out of him. "I told myself for 30 years that I saved those people money in other ways," he said, his voice unsteady. "That the market corrected itself eventually. That nobody was really hurt. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered." He looked briefly toward the gallery, where a row of gray-haired men and women sat together, the surviving families who had traveled from Ohio to watch the trial's final week. "I don't believe that anymore. I think I stopped believing it a long time ago and just never let myself say so out loud." It wasn't an apology. Everyone in the room understood that. But it was. For a man who had spent 3 decades constructing an elaborate lie about who he was, the first entirely true sentence he had spoken in public in longer than anyone could remember. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When the verdicts came back, guilty on every count for Richard, guilty on conspiracy and fraud for Victoria, the gallery did not erupt into cheers the way it does in movies. It simply exhaled, all at once. 3 decades of quiet waiting finally allowed to end. Months passed. The stolen funds, once recovered and untangled from the layers of shell companies Richard had built to hide them, were distributed back to the surviving victims and their families. Modest checks, decades late, that nonetheless meant college tuitions paid, medical bills settled, retirements finally, quietly restored. Richard and Victoria were sentenced in a trial that made headlines up and down the coast. The golden couple of Charleston society revealed, piece by piece, as exactly what they had always been underneath the surgeries and the surname. Ryan cooperated fully with investigators from the very first day. He gave up whatever remained of his inheritance without being asked to, testify to everything he came to understand about the money that had built his childhood, and began, slowly, the long work of becoming a man built on something other than his father's name. Emily did not go back to him. She was, in the end, kind about it. In the way people can only be kind once real anger has burned all the way through. But she chose to walk her own path forward. Unmarried, unattached to the wreckage of that family. Free. On a quiet evening in early autumn, James and Margaret stood together on a small dock overlooking Charleston Harbor, the same coastline that had watched their daughter's wedding fall apart months earlier, and renewed the vows they had first spoken in a courthouse with no guests 30 years before. There was no ballroom this time, no photographer chasing the perfect angle, just the water, the 2 of them, and a handful of people who actually knew the truth of who they were. Margaret's throat was bare. For the first time in 30 years, she had left the house that morning without the necklace, without the familiar cold weight of silver against her collarbone, without the old, automatic reach of her hand toward her own throat whenever a stranger's conversation drifted somewhere near the past. She did not need to carry the truth alone anymore. It had finally been allowed to belong to the world, instead of only to her. Later that evening, after the small vow renewal had ended and the last of their handful of guests had said their goodbyes, Emily found her mother alone at the end of the dock, watching the harbor lights flicker against the dark water. "I keep thinking about all the years I thought I knew you completely," Emily said, sitting down beside her. "And I'm realizing I only ever knew the version of you that survived." "You knew the important parts," Margaret said, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Everything else was just the price of keeping you safe long enough to grow up without ever having to think about any of this." "Do you regret it?" Emily asked. "Any of it? The waiting?" Margaret considered the question for a long moment, watching a fishing boat's lights drift slowly toward the horizon. "I regret that it took a wedding falling apart for the truth to finally matter to anyone," she said. "But I don't regret waiting for the right moment instead of forcing the wrong one. Some truths only do their job when the world is finally ready to hear them." Behind them, James approached quietly, 2 cups of tea in his hands, and settled onto the dock beside his wife the way he had settled beside her for 30 years, without needing to say a word to be understood. "Any regrets, old man?" Margaret asked him, leaning her head against his shoulder, the harbor breeze lifting a strand of gray hair across her bare throat. "Only one," James said, wrapping his arm around her. "That it took the whole world watching for me to finally get to say out loud how proud I am of you." For the first time in longer than any of them could remember, the silence between the 3 of them held nothing hidden inside it at all. Some people think the strongest chains are made of gold, but the strongest chains are the ones forged by truth, patience, and love. Break a necklace, and you may only lose metal. Break someone's dignity, and you may uncover a lifetime of secrets waiting for justice. What would you have done if you were James? Would you have revealed the truth years earlier, the moment it was safe, or waited patiently until everyone responsible finally stood together in one room? Do you think Ryan deserved a second chance after learning the truth about the family that raised him? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more cinematic family mysteries filled with unforgettable twists, powerful lessons, and stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.